Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Facette, Executive Director of Illinois Audubon Society. Thank you for joining us for our third and final program in our three-part series on black-crowned night herons. We've learned about urban wildlife, the natural history of these fabulous birds, and tonight we're going to dig a little deeper into research. So wherever you are, I hope you're warm and cozy on this chilly spring evening. And now I'm going to hand you off to my fellow staff member and the MC for our evening, Brian Fox-Ellis. Brian, it's all yours.
I hope you're as excited as I am. It feels like everything's been building towards this. I've really enjoyed the program by Henry Adams, January 23rd, on adapting to urban landscapes. They put together a big picture for us. And then February 27th, Michael Avera, Dr. Ward, Michael Ward, and Brad Semmel from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Illinois Department of Natural Resources talked about the recovery and demise and some of the natural history in a way. And both of those programs are available at the Illinois Audubon .org/BCNH project. So you can watch those recordings if you weren't there. They were both amazingly exciting and informative and inspiring. Before we get into tonight's program, I do want to thank all of the partners. We really wouldn't be here without the graciousness and hosting of the Lincoln Park Zoo, Liza Lair and Henry Adams, the Bird Conservation Network with Bob Fisher, the Chicago Black Crown Night Heron Project with Amy Lardner, University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana with Sarah tonight, and Michael Avera and Dr. Michael Ward, and of course Brad Semmel from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. It is a stellar team that includes all of you. Looking down the list, there is an amazing group of scientists, citizen scientists, hardcore bird watchers, people who are passionate about the environment, who are here to listen and partake of this knowledge so that we can make a difference. And Joe said this is the third and a three-part series, but the truth is there's one more part I'll tell you more about at the end. We're doing an in-person event at the Lincoln Park Zoo, Twilight in the Rookery, and tickets are available if you would like to join us for that evening of appetizers and conversation where you get to visit the Rookery and meet these scientists and engage in a really dynamic evening to help support this ongoing research. But let's turn our attention to the task at hand. From the University of Illinois, Sarah Slayton is an MS student in Dr. Michael Ward's lab at the university, and she's broadly interested in applied conservation research with specific interest in urban ecology and conservation, habitat choice and use, and wildlife management planning. Currently, she is studying the movement, ecology, and conservation of black-crowned night herons in the Chicago area. And she manages much of the day-to-day field work for this project. And tonight we get to hear about that research that is going on now. We've already seen black-crowned night herons in the Rookery. And I got to be in the field a couple weeks ago to put up some nests for conspecific nesting, and we're hoping to hear more about that tonight. So Sarah, it's all yours. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight and to Brian for the intro. Again, my name is Sarah Slayton, and as Brian said, I'm a first-year master's student in Dr. Michael Ward's lab. And today I will basically be walking you through pretty much the extent of my first year working on the Black-Crowned Night Heron project. So before we jump into the birds, I just wanted to start by giving a very quick background about me. I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 2020, and then took a couple years off to work seasonal positions with a whole bunch of cool animals. But I figure with a Zoom call full of bird lovers, I'll always take the chance to show off a few of the favorite birds that I've gotten to work with. And so, as Brian mentioned, I'm really fascinated by avian ecology and conservation, but really interested in applied conservation work at the ecosystem level, particularly in urban settings. And that's all what really brought me to this project. So here's a quick agenda to outline the black-crowned night heron journey we will be going on tonight. I want to start by quickly reviewing the material from those first two talks that Brian mentioned, just to get us all on the same page. And then I will jump into a description of our team's overarching research questions, the fieldwork involved with this project, what we have learned so far, kind of our plans for the future, and then ways for people to get involved and support our work during this upcoming breeding season. So these two talks comprised of 2 full hours of Henry and then Mike, and Brad discussing the history of black-crowned night-heron colonies throughout Illinois, and I'm going to try and sum it all up in 2 slides. So yes, as Brian mentioned, the links are in the chat if you want to go back and watch those recordings. But just to get us started, black-crowned night-herons are a medium-sized colonial wading bird. I like to describe them as stocky and sneaky because they're a pretty cryptic species. They are the most globally distributed heron species, but their populations are declining in many regions, especially because of habitat loss and degradation. And this is particularly true in the Great Lakes, including Illinois, where they have been listed as state endangered since 1977. Although the species sometimes nests, in individual pairs or smaller groups, they often nest in large rookeries, and the last major colony that we know of in the state of Illinois is centered at the Lincoln Park Zoo in the middle of Chicago. So these graphs come from the Lincoln Park Zoo's records of the herons that nest in Lincoln Park. They collect census and basic reproductive data on the birds and have been every year since they arrived there in 2010. If you want to look at the graph on the left to start, this is basically just showing the proportion of herons at each of these 3 sites. The colors correspond to different areas of Lincoln Park. But as you can see, that blue line kind of steadily increasing into 2022, that is the rookery at the Lincoln Park Zoo. And really, that is the only place where we still have those birds in Lincoln Park. The graph on the right is just kind of looking at the total number of herons nesting across Lincoln Park over these courses of years. And in 2023, we actually had the most reproductively successful year with over 450 chicks from over 650 adults. And so, this all suggests that the birds are doing really well at the zoo colony. But to be honest, we don't really know why. And that really brings us to the research goals that we have. And that's really to better understand how and why this population is thriving in one of the least expected places, and learn how we can use this information to inform future conservation and management for the species in Illinois. So this launches us into our research questions. So the first step in uncovering heron life outside the rookery is to address a very basic question. Where are they going? Specifically, where are they finding food? This is really important for a couple of reasons. The biggest is probably that breeding birds spend the vast majority of their time not in the colony, probably looking for food to bring back for their chicks. Therefore, understanding where they are going can provide us some insight into what they are eating, and the quality of that food is also really important, particularly in the city where urban runoff and pollution can impact food sources and potentially cause long-term negative health effects for the birds. If we are seeing health concerns in specific birds, we might be able to connect it back to the foraging grounds they are using. And then one of migratory birds researchers' favorite questions, where are they spending the rest of the year? So this talk is going to mostly focus on Chicago, but understanding where migratory birds are spending the non-breeding season can provide critical insights into other potential conservation concerns in these other regions that will directly impact the survival of the population. And so these where questions are what we're mostly going to focus on in today's talk. But once we have the where, we still really want to understand the why. What makes these places, good foraging habitat? What makes good breeding habitat? And more simply, why are birds attracted to the places that they are? Understanding these habitat choices can provide us information that can be used to identify particularly important foraging grounds in Chicago and beyond, or identify potentially future breeding sites for the species. And so these are questions that we're really going to be trying to get at once we collect some more data. And then just broadly, how is this species doing in Illinois? We know the birds in the colony have had a very successful couple of years reproductively, but there could be underlying health concerns that could impact the long-term productivity of the species. There could be the potential of heavy metals from their food sources that bioaccumulate through the food chain from the fish that they eat, or infectious diseases such as avian influenza, or parasites that can affect them both internally and externally. And this is really Henry's area of expertise. So again, going back to Henry's original talk, But I also want to touch on how this all impacts the future of the colony at the zoo and the future of other colonies in Illinois. There's a natural cycle to wading bird colonies, and the one at the zoo won't last forever. And that has kind of inspired our team's conspecific attraction work that Mike Ward discussed in a little bit more detail last month, but I will touch on again briefly in a couple of slides. And so pretty much these are big questions. And fortunately, no, I won't have complete answers for you by the end of the talk. But these are the questions that are really guiding our research goals and directions for the next several years of this project. So to answer most of these questions, we really need to figure out how to catch a heron. Unfortunately, it was a lot harder than we expected. There's a lot of information that we can get just from watching them in the colony, but in order to really understand what was going on, we needed to figure out how to learn more about them with the birds in the hand. So ultimately, we ended up with what I like to describe as an extremely Looney Tunes capture methodology that proved surprisingly effective. So it all starts with bait. As you might be able to see, there are fish in this bucket. Originally, we started with live bait and then quickly learned that the herons do not care if it is dead or alive, and we made our lives easier and moved on to frozen. But we take this bait and we put it in a walk-in trap, which, as you can kind of see here, is just a box. Right now, this one doesn't have the back or the door on it, but this is the frame, which kind of gives you the idea of more or less we are attracting the birds to a basic trap location, habituating them with the presence of fish over a period of time. And then ultimately, we end up with birds going inside. And so these are pictures that are from our camera track footage, and that one bar on the right is for me hiding, kind of sneakily watching the birds the first time that we were able to witness them actually entering the trap. And so as you can see, we kind of baited the trap every day, habituate them to this new weird thing in the colony. And luckily, they responded really quickly, and we were able to start catching them. And so that meant we were sitting behind the scenes, waiting, looking at our computer screens on camera, waiting for a bird to enter the trap. And then once they did, we pulled a trigger that activated a door to close. Once we kind of ran around and got the bird out of the trap, the first step is really putting bands on these birds. And so we work as quickly and as carefully as possible. I just want to say real quickly, all of this is done with proper permitting. We're wearing goggles to protect our eyes and to protect the birds through the whole process. But yeah, so we start by putting bands on them. And so on the left, that is us putting a silver federal band on a juvenile's leg. That is kind of always the first step. That is to identify them in kind of the National Bird Banding Registry. And then on the right, that is an alphanumeric band. And so we put those on all of the birds that we are banding to identify them to our project. And that is a lot more visible from a distance, so you can recite them when they're back out in the colony. Then we take a bunch of measurements. These biometrics are really important for us to just have on hand as we're learning more about the species and about the colony. So we get their weight, we measure their legs, we measure their beaks, we measure the lengths of their wings, and then we also actually get feather samples that will run to a lab, and that will help us actually gain insight into whether or not the birds have been exposed to heavy metals, and if so, in what types of concentrations. And then the coolest part, which is really going to be the center of the rest of this talk, is we put a little backpack on them that contains a GPS tracker, and that is our satellite transmitter. And then we release them. So how do the transmitters work? These transmitters are lightweight and solar paneled, so they actually, or solar powered, they weigh less than 3% of the bird's body weight, which is really standard. And they wear it like a backpack. So as you can kind of see in that diagram, it wraps underneath their wings and sits right in the middle of their back. And so doesn't inhibit their flight, doesn't inhibit them in any way. And it kind of sits on their keel, which is basically their sternum. And then those two photos are actually A23, who was our first bird that we tagged and caught last season. And we'll get a little bit more of its story later. But I really just wanted to show that you can barely see that this bird is wearing a tracker from the front. It's preened all of its feathers back into place. And you can really just tell in some of these pictures that Amy managed to get that it's wearing a little bit new identification jewelry. And I'm going to really grossly oversimplify how the trackers actually work, but I do think it's important to understand because it directly influences the amount and the quality of data we are able to actually get from these birds and kind of explain some of the challenges that we had in our first season. So the battery in the transmitter is charged by a small solar panel. And the surface of the solar panel is kind of that flat part of the transmitter that you saw in those photos. And then inside there is an actual GPS tracker, very similar to the one in your phone, for example, that actually is able to triangulate the bird's location using satellites, and collect latitude and longitude information on a schedule that we set. However, we don't automatically get access to that data. The bird then, on another schedule, has to actually come in contact and connect to a cell phone tower. And after that point, it actually uploads to our server and we can start to look at that data. So it doesn't happen every day, but it is really exciting when it does. And this is kind of an example of what we see on our end once a bird has uploaded. This is our portal. We can get access to the individual GPS points collected from the bird and start to see what routes they're taking on a fairly regular schedule. In addition to collecting those GPS points, the transmitters also collect accelerometer data. This is very similar to the bird wearing a Fitbit or like an Apple Watch. Although it can't tell us, how many steps is this bird taking a day, it does measure the bird's activity patterns. And so that diagram in the corner is kind of showing the directionality that correlates with the different colors on that graph. I'm not going to expect you to read it. I can't even really tell you what's going on at this point. But all you really need to know is that this information, when distilled down on a smaller scale, can tell us a lot of really important information about when the bird is active versus at rest. Certain directions that the transmitter was moved can tell us a lot about the actual behaviors that the birds were partaking in. So for example, we should be able to figure out when they were striking. So that might indicate that they were foraging at that time. And this is really important also to just keep tabs on the bird's status. If the bird died or something, or the transmitter were to fall off, it would still work. We would still be getting GPS points from it as long as it was charging and connecting. However, we can use this kind of activity data to make sure the bird is, still moving around. And we really hope to do more analysis with this type of information in the future to really fully better understand black-crowned night-heron activity patterns during the breeding season and be able to compare it to other times of the year. So to wrap up this little fieldwork session, I also just wanted to touch back on the conspecific attraction work that was mentioned earlier. And please go back to the last talk if you want some more context for this project. But I really did just want to give an update that our conspecific attraction site at Big Marsh is up and running for the season. And so we went back out there a couple of weeks ago and put black-crowned night-heron decoys and call boxes that are playing vocalizations at dawn and dusk back out at this peninsula at Big Marsh that we identified as potentially suitable breeding habitat for the birds. And this year, we actually added another component to our quote-unquote fake breeding colony, handmade heron nests. And so as you can see in that picture in the middle, those are actually nests that were made by Amy and Brian and some other volunteers that we are hoping will be another signal that this is a potentially good breeding habitat. We know black-crowned night-herons will reuse nests from year to year, and so it could be another piece of like a visual cue that could attract them to this site. And yeah, really quick shout out to Amy and Brian for helping set those up and make them because they look amazing. Okay, so now what you've all been patiently waiting for through this series. What have we learned so far about black-crowned night-herons after putting satellite tags on them? So first of all, we banded 16 birds last year. Henry's team banded some other juveniles in previous years, but now we have 4 adults and 12 more juveniles with federal and alphanumeric bands. And then we deployed 7 of these transmitters on 4 adults and 3 juveniles in June and July. Unfortunately, we have had some challenges with transmitter charging and function. Some of the birds we know actually covered up the solar panels with their feathers, which was an unanticipated hiccup and has definitely interfered with charging. But, we're working on it. And this was a huge task that could not have happened without the help of so many people. And we have some preliminary results that I'm excited to share with you. So first of all, this is a list of all of the places in Chicago that birds tagged last year visited, just to give you an overarching idea of the areas used. The colony is that red dot, red shape, kind of along that coast of Lake Michigan. And then each of those yellow stars corresponds to one of the places on this list. And as you can see, you see that a lot of those habitats are kind of along the coast of Lake Michigan, but there are also some locations further inland where the birds are utilizing other green spaces that are spread throughout the city. And so Chicago heron spotters may notice some of the places on this list are really expected locations. And there might be local heron hotspots that are left off this list. But I just want to reiterate that this is just from 5 birds, and we are quickly confirming that there's a ton of individual variation between where these birds are going. And so this is just kind of a broad overview. But now I want to highlight 2 tagged adults and 2 juveniles to get us all inside the mind of a Chicago-dwelling black-crowned night heron. Okay. So this is A24. This is an adult that we tagged at the end of June. And so I will say these are all pretty late breeding season movements. But hopefully this will work. Yeah, if you see up at the top where that red is, that is the colony. And you can see very quickly that this bird, this is sped up by the way, this bird is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to a green space on the about 5 miles southwest of the colony. And aside from a couple of other very brief excursions, it's pretty directly just going back and forth. When you map it out, this is what that looks like. And so that location is actually Douglas Park, which many of you Chicagoans may be familiar with. And it's a relatively large park southwest of the colony that has several large ponds that this bird was utilizing pretty much every day. And so the bird's repeated use of this one site without much exploration kind of suggests that this was a preferred habitat for it. It was worth flying several miles over the city to reach and forage at, as opposed to using some of the other thoughtful areas kind of along the coast. And so that was kind of our first example of, oh, this was kind of an unexpected finding, this consistency of use. And then A23 is kind of the other adult that we're going to focus on tonight, that first one that you saw pictures of earlier. And so this bird also seemed to primarily use one foraging area. Now the colony's at the bottom, but you can see it flying back and forth to Montrose Harbor. This bird is really using Montrose Harbor pretty exclusively for the first month that it was wearing this tag. And then later you can start to see it using several other habitats. And so those include North Pond, Bill Jarvis Bird Sanctuary, and Belmont Harbor. And so, you know, this could start to suggest that the bird's foraging habits are changing based on things that are happening during the season, maybe varying food availability. So for example, we actually know at Montrose Harbor, there are seasonal shifts in fish spawning, and we were able to actually see differences in black-crowned night heron presence there. So that could be indicative of, you know, some changing behavior, but at least for a while, that did seem to be its preferred foraging ground. And it also might have been that by late July or mid-July, the bird's nest at the colony had fledged or failed, and it was just kind of seeking out other places to roost and hang out in the city. Unpacking these details is going to require some more analysis and some more data, but really fun to start seeing. And so yeah, this is basically what it looks like on that map. You can see kind of those clumps of green are indicative of places the bird spent more time, with Montrose Harbor at the top and the colony at the bottom. And now we're going to shift into our juveniles. So just a reminder, these are birds that were fully fledged, so they had left the nest, they had left their parents, and they were fully flighted by the time they were tagged. So they didn't have any breeding requirements, and they're really interesting to look at because we can use them to explore differences between age classes in terms of their movement behavior and learn more about areas that young birds are actually using as they're first on their own, leaving the colony and kind of learning how to be a bird. So once again, the colony is going to be kind of down here. And as you can see, kind of start small, going down to South Pond, exploring locally nearby, kind of starting to branch out more and more. And then all of a sudden shoots out and takes off to the river. And you'll see that this video is going to end there. That bird left. That bird left Chicago very soon after we tagged it, which you know, wouldn't necessarily expect for a young bird, but we're going to wrap back around to this bird again a little bit later. And then finally, our last case study, this is A22. A22 was actually one of the first birds we caught before we even caught any adults. When the bird was super young and had been kind of running around in the colony way before it was flighted. We were able to put bands on it, but we don't put transmitters on until the birds are a certain size and weight because we don't want to interfere with their growth process. But we kept tabs on this bird. He started showing up on cameras, sneaking fish all the time. We accidentally caught him again a couple of times. And so once the bird was large enough, we actually did catch it again and put a transmitter on it so we could get to see what it did once it was ready to leave the colony. So here the colony is actually up top. The bird is going to go south. And so once again, kind of starting out small in that little area, that red dot is really little. And then it starts to branch out a little bit more and then boom, takes off, heads down to Northerly Island and Burnham Harbor. All the way down at the bottom is actually a cemetery that the bird seemed to be spending time at. And so this bird, instead of going back and forth to the colony, has left the colony and is now starting to explore various other places to hang out. Seems to be kind of hanging out in one place for a little while, then moving on to another, and then moving on to another. And so this juvenile and maybe others seems to be doing a lot of exploring once they can kind of get around. And they're learning, what are the best places to hang out? Where can I find foods? And basically learning how to be a black-crowned night heron. And so that was really cool to see from a young bird doing so much movement in the city, very different pattern. And unfortunately, we did lose touch with this bird at this point. It did stop connecting to the cell phone towers. Possible something happened to the bird, young dumb herons getting themselves into trouble. But it also, we could have just lost touch with the transmitter because of other technological issues. So that kind of wraps up kind of looking specifically at individual birds. But I do want to take a step back and talk about what we can kind of learn about this so far. And so those pictures are kind of zoomed in of a couple of different habitats that we were just talking about. And it seems like these birds are really good examples of black-crowned night herons choosing to forage in these urban green spaces that also contain water features. And so that could be urban parks. It could also be the harbors along Lake Michigan, areas along the river, but even areas like this cemetery that has some other bodies of water, but isn't necessarily managed in the same kind of way. And some birds are choosing inland ponds over water features that might be closer to the colony or along Lake Michigan, which suggests there is, good habitat in other parts of the city. And we've also learned, again, these sample sizes are really small. So this is all just kind of me trying to explain the behavior. But the adult birds might have one or a few kind of preferred foraging grounds that they frequent during the breeding season, reliable sources for food that, could vary over the course of the season. But right now we're really just looking at one time period. While juveniles are kind of showing more exploratory behavior once they disperse from the colony. And so, there's a lot of individual variation. And we may start to see different patterns once we have tagged birds starting earlier in the spring. But it has been really cool just to start watching these birds move around the city and really get validation and confirmation of what people have thought they're doing outside of the colony. And so this is a map that I threw together real quickly just to give you a sense of the area that these birds are covering. This is a static version of the data. They don't all cover the same period of time, but they're all basically approximate home ranges based on the individual GPS point of all of these birds that I was just talking about. And so that little house in the middle is the colony. And really, obviously, you can see that the birds are spreading out in all different directions. They are using different amounts of area. And they're using different spaces, and they're really covering large swaths of the city. And so we really need to understand these behavior, in order to understand these patterns better, we need more birds to be able to piece it apart. But at the very least, we can see really quickly that they're using huge parts of Chicago, and, it's really important to have these green spaces throughout the city. So we learned a lot of lessons in our first breeding season. The first big one was that our trapping efforts did not cause colony disturbance. This was a concern of ours when we were trying to figure out how to catch the birds. But very quickly it proved that the birds, very adaptable urban livers. As you can kind of see in this camera, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but there's a camera trap photo, black and white, in the bottom right. And that is one of our birds that has already been tagged walking right back into the trap the next day. We saw a lot of this. We saw it's what biologists call trap happy, birds that, recognize this is a food source. And even though they've gone through the whole process of being tagged and being handled, the pros outweigh the cons. And so that really was encouraging in terms of kind of our plans for the following years. Additionally, we have learned that birds are in fact from the Lincoln Park colony spreading out across the city and are using a variety of urban foraging habitats. And this really just reiterates, we really want to start tagging birds earlier in the season now that we know how to do it. So we can look at habitat use and behavior changes over the course of the entire breeding season. And this is particularly true of the adults who, are going from nest building to raising their chicks to having chicks fledge. And so there's a lot more potential variation in their movement patterns that we'd love to learn more about. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit. And this talk is mostly aimed at what's going on in Chicago. But as I mentioned earlier, understanding the habitats that birds use outside of the breeding season is also critically important to their conservation and survival. And so that brings us to this period that comes after the breeding season completes, between July and October-ish, when a lot of young herons especially are still hanging out in Chicago, but many of the adults leave, and some of the juveniles will leave with them. And so this is called cleverly the post-breeding season. And this period exists for all migratory birds, but the length of time and the dispersal patterns vary widely between species. It's a very important time period because it's when birds kind of, recuperate from the breeding season and fuel up for migration. And post-breeding dispersal in lots of different directions has been observed in wading birds regularly. But there hasn't been a ton of research on it because it's really hard to follow these birds around. Previous studies have mostly focused on just juveniles because we know they kind of spread out based on banding records or just short-term telemetry data. But since our transmitters keep working, it's been a really exciting opportunity to use this new tracking technology to explore what the birds are doing during the post-breeding season. So this is a map showing the 3 birds that we just talked about, those 2 adults and then A35, that one juvenile, after they have all left Chicago. They all went to Wisconsin. And for those of you who might know a little bit about typical avian migration, it might surprise you too that the birds went north. I know we were shocked. And because when you think of most North American migrants, you think, okay, they're getting ready for the breeding season. Why spend all that energy going in the opposite direction of where you're ultimately going to migrate? And so I do just want to point, we're going to dive into these habitats in a second, but I do just want to point out our 2 adults, A24 and A23, the red and the yellow. Both are kind of compressed to small areas, concentrated. The red is all the way up in Green Bay. The yellow stayed near Racine. Whereas our juvenile, the green, used a ton of different habitats all over the place between July and October. So once again, the adults are showing pretty direct paths, almost as if they know where they're going. Maybe they do, maybe we don't. While the juvenile is doing a whole lot of exploring. So let's zoom into some of those habitats. So A24, this is the bird that went all the way up to Green Bay. This is the one that was going to and from Douglas Park. Went all the way to Green Bay, Wisconsin. It barely stopped on the way there. It really just went shot directly up there and settled into these 3 main areas near the bay. And just from aerial imagery, we can really quickly see that these are marshy wetland areas that mostly are further away from development. We see a little bit of, some buildings on that further right area, but for the most part, these are places we expect to see herons. We're out of the city now. And this is where you think, most wading birds actually live. Whether or not it's really intuitive that they go all the way up to Wisconsin to get there, at least on the surface, it seems like somewhere a heron might want to hang out and kind of recuperate. And then we have A23, that bird that was using Montrose Harbor. This bird also went pretty much straight to Racine and stayed in a very small area, really just moving between these 2 locations. However, this habitat looks very different than what we were just looking at. This is very much almost like a suburban industrial area of what look like really man-made bodies of water. Spending a lot of time at the S.C. Johnson Sam's campus in Racine, Wisconsin. Yes, the manufacturing company, and then a recycling plant. And so, this is a great example of why we're asking the questions that we are. showed up at these man-made water features in suburban Racine. Maybe not so different than the areas that they were using in Chicago, but what was attractive of these sites, rather than the myriad of other wetland areas along Lake Michigan, or even staying in Chicago? And, has this bird been here before and decided, oh yeah, this is the place to be? We don't know, but hopefully we'll be able to find out. And really just shows kind of the adaptability and unpredictability of these birds. And then finally, we have A35. This is our juvenile, who is the one who took off along the Chicago River pretty soon after being tagged. And as mentioned, this bird just kind of went all over the place. After leaving Chicago, it actually shot up to Milwaukee and spent a lot of time using Milwaukee as a home base before taking a bunch of adventures sort of further up the Wisconsin coast, and eventually settling in Lake Winnebago. And I wanted to include this slide and map just to really show you the amount of moving that this bird is doing during this time period. And so these are just a couple of the habitats that the bird is actually just using. But I really wanted to zoom in and show you, this is downtown Milwaukee. This is an area that looks a lot like those habitats that we were looking in Chicago. So maybe this urban raised bird is seeking out similar things to what it was exposed to when it just kind of started leaving the colony. But it also used ponds in the middle of ag fields, followed various different river systems, and ultimately ended up at another natural area, where it's kind of on Lake Winnebago, where there are these islands, and it definitely looks a little bit more like a wetland. And so, this bird is doing a lot of exploring during this time period, experimenting with different habitats, and showing a very different pattern of movement than either of the adults we just looked at. And so, unfortunately, we did end up losing contact with this bird towards the end of October, which is on the later end of when we would have expected it to start migrating. So, it's possible that it wasn't able to finish migration or something else happened. Many birds, this is a very vulnerable time period in their lives, but it's not impossible that we won't get a ping from this bird again once that transmitter starts working. And so I just whipped through a lot of information about the bird's post-breeding movements, and we'll admit again that, if anything, it leaves us with more questions than answers. And much of what I was just suggesting is really just educational guessing. I can't ask the birds why Wisconsin was the right place to spend the post-breeding season. However, researchers do have some hypotheses about what birds are doing when they disperse during these periods, and I can take a stab at it. And so number one is probably following seasonal changes in food availability. We know wading birds are very good at this. You will see this in other species as well. They will really spread out, potentially actually leaving the areas where they were all breeding together because they've depleted a lot of those local resources. And so they will travel to areas where theoretically there won't have been breeding birds and there might be more food to kind of stock up for migration. This could very much be true about Wisconsin and be an explanation for why the birds would be moving in that direction to places where, historically there might have been breeding colonies, but there aren't anymore, and there just could be more resources available. Additionally, the birds molt during this period, and so herons do it on kind of a funky schedule, but they will lose some of their primary wing feathers as well as their body feathers during this time period, and so maybe this is a place to spend time where they are a little bit more vulnerable, kind of preparing for migration. And then there are also some possible evolutionary ideas. So birds nest in these big colonies, theoretically, as kind of a protection from predators, predator avoidance thing, especially for their nests. But once the breeding season is over and the pros of that no longer outweigh the cons, maybe they're spreading out to just reduce competition between conspecifics, and also reducing the threats of overcrowding that can lead to disease. And so, there are all of these questions. We are hoping to be able to get on the ground there and take a better look at these habitats to explore these possible reasons. But what we can say, just looking at the satellite data, is that these birds, we can probably guess that it varies at the age, class, the population, and the individual level. So juveniles might be, getting a lay of the land or orienting themselves in preparation for returning to Chicago or these other sites in following years when it is their turn to breed. And adults might have, a favorite spot they know to return to from previous years. And we also know that some adults and juveniles stay in Chicago during this period, even through the winter. And so ultimately, this period is another really important piece of the conservation puzzle, and an area we really hope to explore more deeply once we have more tagged birds. But for now, it's just been really cool to see where some of these birds are going before they migrate. And then we have migration, which was super exciting to see. We know that many black-crowned night herons kind of along the eastern seaboard, and theoretically through the Midwest, winter kind of in the Caribbean, Florida, maybe South America. But this is the first time we can actually look at the direct migration path of a bird from the Chicago colony. And so this is A24, the bird that was all the way up in Green Bay. And so it migrated starting at the beginning of, well, middle of September, and actually traveled back through Chicago on its way down to Florida, which was very exciting. It actually went back to Douglas Park and hung out at Douglas Park for almost 4 whole days to kind of refuel from that first leg of the journey, which is really just a testament that this bird loves Douglas Park, which is very exciting. It made several other small stops in Tennessee and Georgia along the way, and then ultimately settled in kind of an agricultural looking area near Gainesville, Florida for several weeks before heading down to this area right near Lake Okeechobee, which is a big area known for migratory birds. But it's actually spending time on the corner of the Seminole tribe of Florida's Brighton Reservation, which was really exciting, and I'll talk about a little more. And so this is a close-up of those wintering grounds that A24 is using. And so as you can see on the left, that's kind of the tip of Florida. That big body of water is Lake Okeechobee. But that red outline is actually the size of the reservation. And so we know this bird is utilizing what's considered a working landscape, which features areas of restored wetlands intermixed with cattle ranching. And that's a really cool thing to see, that this bird is using this restored habitat that is also being used for other purposes. And we're actually in contact with the environmental team at the Brighton Reservation. And we are really trying to learn more about how they are managing this land and how we can connect this back to the benefits that it's providing for black-crowned night herons and other species throughout this time of year. So please keep your eyes out for some updates on that front, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But to the right, that's kind of a zoom in, and you can see the bird has really just been hanging out in this one corner for the entire winter. We actually know that it's still there as of last weekend when I got my last upload. So we're really excited to see when this bird kind of takes off and starts migrating, and hopefully we'll be back in Chicago fairly soon. And then this is actually A23, that Montrose bird who was hanging out in Racine at the recycling plant. This is where that bird is wintering. Unfortunately, that battery has been on the fritz, so we don't always get the most consistent uploads from it, but we do actually know where it ended up after migration. And so as you can see on the left, kind of in the middle of this map is New Orleans. So we're down kind of on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. And that little box is where we start to see the bird hanging out for the winter. And as you can see from the satellite imagery, this is kind of more what we expect from a wintering heron. This is very natural, wetland, marshy area, and surrounding this area is actually a bunch of natural wildlife refuges and various different preserves. And once again, this is showing like how important these protected and managed areas really are for migratory species, even when they're only there for parts of the year. And so that was the last map that I have for you today. I know it was a little bit of a whirlwind, but before wrapping up, I do really want to take a minute and reiterate why we're doing this research and why we really want it to continue over the next couple of years. Even from just a few birds, we now have so much more information about the adaptability of the species and the range of habitats that they are using to survive in Chicago. We can really emphasize that urban green spaces with water features are critical to serving these birds that are nesting at the zoo. And there may be some predictable patterns in their movement behavior depending on their age. These transmitters should also last several years. And so we hope to get more data from each of these birds to look at longer term trends, including kind of site fidelity to some of these locations. And we can also hopefully incorporate what we learned from our health sampling and activity pattern data to get a better sense of how this colony is doing overall, and learning more about the spaces this population really relies on during the non-breeding season. And so ultimately, We believe this project will really advance our understanding of the behavior and ecology of this cryptic species of conservation concern in the Midwest, help inform our future management decisions to help them persist in the state, and showcase how we can create and maintain urban spaces that can help biodiversity thrive. So what's next? As some of you may be aware, some of the herons are actually already back in Chicago. Henry told us this morning that we have 12 adults and 2 juveniles that are hanging out at the colony as of this morning. And as I have mentioned, we've had some issues with the transmitters from last year, but we're actually going with a new company that has a raised solar panel, so we should be able to avoid kind of that feather covering solar panel charging issue. And we want to put a lot more out. And so they'll collect basically the same data, but hopefully we will have a much larger sample size to be talking about these patterns next year. And then more exciting news, we've gotten more permission to collect a bunch of other additional biological samples that will help us learn a lot more about what's going on in the colony and allow Henry to work some of that population physical health data collection that we'll be really excited to add to this whole opportunity. And then we're also actually expanding our conspecific attraction work. So in addition to what we're doing at Big Marsh, we will also be expanding to a second site in Lake County called Almond Marsh. And that's an area that is another historical kind of rookery location that we think could be near some other smaller groups of potentially nesting birds. So overall, many exciting advancements and changes that will hopefully enhance our data collection and knowledge about the species in the upcoming breeding season. And so if you are interested in getting involved, there could be opportunities for volunteers this season. And we're really, really trying to, engage the public with this project. These birds are so central to Chicago, and we really love working with the community. And so we actually have a link that I will drop in the chat. It is to a website called Survey 123. And we are using that right now for people to report banded bird sightings. So those bands that I was talking about earlier, if you see a heron and it has a band on it, we really want you to send it to this link so we can keep track of where the birds are going, especially those that don't have transmitters. Amy Lardner, another amazing member of our team, she has been making these heron nests and is working on another event later this week. So she may be hosting similar events in the future. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, her contact information is on the screen, and I can also drop it in the chat. And if you're interested in kind of general future opportunities, you can contact me. You can just send me an email. I am compiling a list of people to kind of reach out to as those opportunities arise, and would be more than happy to kind of expand that list as people show interest. And then finally, we are getting ready for our Twilight in the Rookery, a behind the scenes adventure that Brian, I'm sure, will be talking about more in a couple of minutes. So with that, we can take questions. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really exciting. Again, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. I'll be moderating and answering some of those. And actually, based on your last note, I want to start with one of the questions that came in near the end, a two-part question. Don Davis asked, what is the ideal sample size, and are funds available for enough transmitters? Admittedly, we're here in part to help support this research. So Twilight in the Rookery is a chance for you to come and spend an evening with these brilliant scientists, to engage in conversations. We're going to have 3 small stations so that you'll rotate around, so you get time in the rookery, time with Sarah and the tracking devices, and to look at current data, and time with Mike and Brad to talk about the ongoing research and broader natural history. And this is a limited event, so we do encourage you to buy tickets, and we've already sold quite a few. And that evening will be a chance for you to help support. All funds will go to support this research, which kind of answers Don Davis's question, are funds available for enough transmitters? Illinois Audubon Society's role as the oldest member-driven conservation organization in the state, Illinois Audubon being older than National Audubon, we've already made a commitment to buy the transmitters for the season, but your funds can help buy additional transmitters so we can get to those higher sample sizes that Donald was asking about. And also, if we have more trackers out there, then Sarah's going to need more help, and would like to be able to fund a couple of interns and some more college students who are willing to do the research to help Henry with the sampling of blood tissue and feathers and looking at heavy metal and all the really intriguing things that came up tonight. So Mike and Mike have answered some of the questions in the Q&A, but let me, in the chat, I mean, but let's go back to one of the first questions that came in was from, let me zoom up here. There you go. Mark Luscombe asked that he understands there's a similar black-crowned night-heron colony at the National Zoo in Washington. Are there other examples of these colonies in zoos?
Yes.
And Mike Avera asked it online, but go ahead, Sarah or Mike, either one.
Oh yeah, I'll just quickly finish answering Dawn's question. Yes, so we are currently set to have enough transmitters for this upcoming season, but our ideal sample size will be at least 20 to 25 birds. Obviously, and that's just for kind of this next year total. Ultimately, you know, as many birds as possible, but that's about what we're shooting for with the current number of transmitters that we have funding for as we speak. In terms of the other colonies, yes, there is the colony at the National Zoo. There's also actually another colony at the Detroit Zoo. I think it's slightly smaller, but I do know that there are also birds there and some work that is being done there. I don't know, Mike, if you had any other off the top of your head that you knew about.
No, that's all I had. Although Amy also added San Antonio Zoo had one as well at one point.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I knew they had some other wader colonies down there. I wasn't sure if it was just black crowns or other species.
There's a pretty large mixed species colony at the San Antonio River Walk, I believe, in one of their big city parks, and I believe also at the Oakland Zoo, which is how Oakland, California adopted them as their city bird.
Actually, it's not at the Oakland Zoo, Henry. They're participating in the rescue. Those rookeries are over urban streets in Oakland, but Oakland Zoo is very involved too. Yes.
Oh, okay. Maybe that must be it. Was it ever over Oakland Zoo property? I know they moved around a bit.
They have moved around a bit, and there's been some issues around tree removal, and there's a long history there. But they were originally in Lake Merritt, which is the first national wildlife refuge in Oakland, California. So they've had a long history there.
Cool.
Which raises all kinds of questions about urban wildlife and how these birds are adapting and how this research helps us to understand that better. Rena Cohen asked, do the trackers track the bird in migration or only in the Chicago area? How long do they last? That was somewhat answered, but if you wanted to speak more specifically to that, Sarah?
Yeah, I can definitely reiterate. So yes, in theory, they should all function for several years. It really just comes down to how well they're charging and how well they are uploading to the service. So we only had that one migration route this year, partially just because we were having those battery charging issues. But we are really hoping with the new transmitters that we're going to be using this year from a different company with those raised solar panels that we're not going to have that problem. And so we should hopefully be able to get multiple years of data from each bird. Kind of depends on the situation, but depending on how well they are charging, probably between 2 and 4 years.
Great. And not so much a question, but I think it's a comment that bears repeating. Cynthia Canner asked or just stated, I'm interested in any activity on the Fox River between Algonquin and the Dundees. And we do hope all of you, wherever you live, are looking out for black-crowned night herons. And if you see a tag, then go to the 123, the link that Sarah will share. But also eBird, if there's any volunteers here who want to help us, eBird is not always the cleanest thing to surf for very specific data. But if somebody once a week wanted to go in and look at eBird sightings of black-crowned night herons in Illinois and share that data, that would help Sarah quite a bit. So if you see any, please post them to eBird as well. Then Bob Stanley asked, is there any concern that even the relatively small added weight of a tracker might slow a bird in migration and reduce its chances for a successful trip? This is a great question because I'm sure a lot of people are concerned about this. And Mike Avera began to answer that. Mike, did you want to answer that out loud for everybody?
Sure. Just in general, just from an ethical standpoint, when we tag birds, we ensure that the tag and any auxiliary or accessory markers that we add to the bird don't sum up to more than 5% of the bird's mass. So it is something that we look at on an individual basis. although Mike Ward answered it a little bit more fully as well.
It was great to watch the chat all the way through because there was lots of back and forth, people responding. And so scrolling down, there's a number of questions that were answered further into your talk. So looking, Diane Eubanks asked, is there still a colony at the south end of Chicago Lakeshore near Calumet Park? I thought there was a large colony by the old Ford plant.
So there were birds down in Calumet through about 2011 was when those birds finally left the colony. They were there starting in the 1980s. So there were really long-term colonies in those marshes kind of surrounding the Lake Calumet region. But unfortunately, all of those birds did abandon that area after kind of 2011. And those are likely the birds that founded the colonies up in Lincoln Park. And if you're interested in kind of more details on that, that's what Brad, Mike, and Mike's talk about a month ago was all about. And so, yeah, that's a great place to look for some more information about those colonies specifically.
And then I'll sneak in a question. I really love the image of the 5 maps, yellow and red and the different colors. And I was curious about those 5 maps overlaid. Is this the kind of dispersal common for black-crowned night herons and other herons in the post-breeding season?
Yeah. So as far as we understand, so I've done kind of a deep dive on the post-breeding season work because it's something we've been especially curious about. Because I will say none of us expected them to go to Wisconsin. And so there has definitely been reporting from other studies. Honestly, specifically, not in almost, since 1950, I think was the last time someone mentioned black-crowned night herons migrating north, maybe from banding studies that were done, almost a century ago at this point. There have been some other studies that have seen, birds going north. And we do see that kind of observationally. Birders probably, around the country will start to see those flamingos and those roseate spoonbills and those limpkins this past year, all of those wading birds that kind of popped up all over the place north of where you would expect them to be. That's a really good example of kind of this post-breeding dispersal behavior amongst wading birds. And so we're not really 100% sure why they are doing it or why the black-crowned night heron specifically went here. But it's not unheard of by any means. There just hasn't been a lot of formal research studying it. And because we haven't had this technology that can take a bird from a breeding site to a post-breeding site to a migration site until fairly recently, we think this is a really exciting area to explore so we can better understand the specific habitats that they are using during this time period.
Great. And Randy Schitzel, the president of Illinois Audubon Society, asked, have invasive aquatic species changed the diet or food availability of black-crowned night herons the past few decades? Mike did answer that in the chat, but Mike, did you want to answer that out loud for everybody?
Yeah, just briefly, I know some people consider alewives an invasive species or non-native species, and historically in the Chicago area and Lake Michigan, they've been present in large numbers. And given that black-crowned night herons are very opportunistic foragers, they'll take advantage of something that numerous spawning. And oftentimes that's what we were witnessing in Montrose Harbor as we began initial trapping efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And these guys, they're eating all sorts of stuff. We would love to get deeper into, what specifically they are eating. But there have been accounts of them eating French fries. So I can't imagine that they won't take advantage of the food sources available.
Who doesn't love a good French fry?
I can throw out there little supplementary is that we do see quite a lot of crayfish and other crustacean exoskeletons as excrement around the rookery, much like owls, even though they don't necessarily compress them down into something as nice and neat as a pellet, they do regurgitate undigestible materials like exoskeletons. So we do see, crustacean skeletons. And as Sarah was mentioning, we're excited to be able to do a lot of really cool things with heron blood. And one of the things that we can do with that is looking at dietary stable isotopes. So if a heron is eating a lot of really protein rich food, then a lot of nitrogen will pop up. But if it's eating a lot of French fries, like Sarah was saying, a lot more carbon proportionally will pop up. So we can also get a better understanding for not only how invasive species are changing their diet, but also urban living in general. Are they accessing more nutrient rich, quote unquote, natural diets? Are they also using more anthropogenic food sources? We're excited to find out.
Absolutely.
And the questions just keep coming in. I don't know if we'll get through all of them, but let me clump three together. Diane Eubanks says that they took pictures of black-crowned night herons at Almond Marsh, and Mark asked, is there a long-term goal to encourage formation of more colonies to avoid the threat of disease? And will we be and then Bob's asked if we're trying to establish a colony at Almond Marsh, how would you do that? So all those three together add up to a really good question.
Yeah, absolutely. And others feel free to chime in. But yes, so we are really trying to help kind of expand the number of places that black-crowned night herons are nesting in the state. In addition, the colony is doing great, but at some point that colony, there are only so many trees, there's only so much space. And for example, disease outbreaks and other kind of risks to abandonment when all the birds are kind of concentrated in one location, it would be better for the population to be spread out in multiple locations. And so that is what we're doing at Big Marsh. And the way we are doing that is we are actually doing a conch-specific attraction experiment. And that basically means black-crowned night herons, like other colonial wading birds, are drawn to areas where there are other members of their species. And so we put out these basically plastic herons and call boxes that play vocalizations. And this year we put those nests up, and those are hopefully going to, birds that are flying over, coming back up. Florida right now may actually come across those and see it as potentially good breeding habitat before they settle back at the zoo. And then, yes, we are trying to do the same thing at Almond Marsh. So we do know that there have been, reports of birds nesting there in the past and nesting in the nearby area. And although we don't know that they have been super recently, we're going to try and do the same thing there. And that's kind of what we're gearing up to do in the next couple of weeks here.
And I can chime in real quickly because I believe that you had asked about the relevance of disease to that, trying to spread the population out a little bit more. So a lot of the research that we're planning on doing this year is trying to investigate exactly what pathogens are impactful to black-crowned night herons. The literature is relatively scarce on that. So, a hot button topic that Sarah mentioned is, of course, high pathogenicity avian influenza, HPAI. Not a lot of studies have been conducted to see exactly how negatively impacted or neutrally impacted these birds are by this particular disease. So that's one thing that we're going to try and qualify and see how that factors into, the risk of one highly localized population being extirpated.
Thank you, Henry. Again, the questions keep coming in along with a lot of thank yous. So I do want to pause for just a second and say thank you to all of the researchers, and the fact that all of you came this evening and contribute your voices and insight and knowledge. Thank you. But Katarina McLean asked, do we know why the birds ended up choosing Lincoln Park Zoo specifically a decade ago? And is that one of your research questions?
Yeah, so we have some hypotheses. It's impossible to know for sure. And Henry, if you want to chime in, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'll briefly rehash a few of the summarizations that Sarah was mentioning earlier of my talk a couple of months ago. But as many of you are probably familiar already, there were so many different locations throughout Lincoln Park that these birds were selecting, and largely they were selecting for relatively primary successional. So these are fast growing tree species. So ashes and alders and willows, etc. These are often species that are found growing in riparian or wetland areas. So pretty much in alignment for the trees that they would be more selecting for in more quote unquote natural exurban environments. And Lincoln Park just happens to be rife with these particular tree species, or at least has been historically. Of course, when the allay was taken down in 2014, that was a bit of a disruptor because of emerald ash borer. But really, they began settling over, we believe, over the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo because of the abundance of just, tree species that have similar what's called scaffolding. So basically the arrangement of the branching limbs, the angle that the limbs branch at from the main trunk, how the density of said branching, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the tree species that we have back there Of course, we have tons of red maples, sugar maples, but we do also have lots of alders, lots of great river birches. So again, similarly, those fast-growing primary successional, more riparian zone trees that are just kind of, really good habitat for these birds. And so I've actually been taking I've been learning to play a botanist on television lately and taking a lot of measurements of these trees and where these birds are nesting within these trees. So cataloging each individual nest, about 400 nests are in total at this colony, and basically trying to develop a statistical function that can tell us which trees they're selecting for and what specific height of particular tree species they are selecting for, so that we can use that to inform other habitat remediation, both in Chicago and in exurban areas. We also think that there's a potential that they've been exploiting what's called mesocarnivore release theory. To break that down, it's essentially a release from the pressures that medium-bodied predators may put upon a colony. So we're talking raccoons, possums, snakes that might be a little bit more arboreal, might be able to climb into these trees and gobble up eggs at a pretty alarming rate, right? Or even gobble up hatched out chicks. We have red wolves at the zoo, and these wolves potentially present a pressure upon those more smaller sized carnivores and keep them away from our herons, kind of keep them protected in exchange for, a few heron chicks dropping down to the floor every once in a while. This whole relationship that we see between colonial nesting wading birds and larger bodied carnivores is replicated in a lot of natural systems, including, largely American alligators, as well as all of the different species that nest down in the southeastern portion of North America. So in short, really good trees and bodyguards are maybe why they're selecting for Pritzker Family Children's Zoo. We, as Sarah said, don't know for certain, but hope to be piecing more pieces of the puzzle together bit by bit.
Great. And that kind of anticipates one of the other questions. So I'll just mention and we can move on. A woman who has a home in Florida and sees black-crowned night-herons down there. It would be really cool if you saw one with one of our tags on it. Please report that. And then Karen Gibson asked donations for the tagging project. Illinois Audubon Society is the nonprofit that is managing some of the funds for this research. So the Twilight and the Rookery is a chance to come and meet the researchers and to potentially make some contributions. But after that event, we will set up a page where you can, help to support one of the tracking devices or pay for the summer intern, or depending on how generous you feel and what level you want to help. And that'll all be on our website later. And Kathy asked if there will be a copy of the presentation. All three presentations are, two of them are already posted, and as soon as we get this one edited, it will also be on the Illinois Audubon Society, illinoisaudubon.org/BCNH, and that's already posted here. Sarah did post Banded Birds, still a lot of black-crowned night-heron steelworkers park, but I don't think they're nesting there. And how much do transmitters cost? They're $1,200 each. Plus, that's just the mechanical device. The time and the research and the supporting the people who are collecting the data and crunching the numbers is also important. And I'm scrolling on down. So a lot of great comments. And seeing other questions. And Amy, thank you for reminding us. We're really focused on launching this summer's research, but this is ideally a long-term project. We're already a couple of years in, and so we're looking for support well into the future. And Amy also asked a question we often hear: black-crowned night-herons are of least concern worldwide. Why do this? Why do black-crowned night-herons matter? Who would like to take that one?
I think all of us probably have our own answers. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
They're beautiful, dapper birds.
Sarah,
I love them.
Sarah, why don't you lead the charge?
Hey, I can take it.
Go ahead, Bob. It'd be great to hear from you. Love that.
Just to let Sarah off the hook a little bit. Fundamentally, why does any species matter is sort of a philosophical question. but the fact is that, if you will, the web of life that exists is dependent on interdependence between species. And if we keep yanking threads out of the web, eventually, somebody famous once said that the tapestry will collapse. And so black-crowned night herons are important in the sense that they provide functions to other wildlife, etc. And they don't, how shall I say this? They represent part of that web of life once again. And I think sometimes we forget that. We're, what is it, anthropocentric, I guess. So what do you think, Sarah? Is that a reasonable answer?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, this ecosystem is
It was
all
Jane Goodall who said that, by the way.
Yes. And I think that is a great note to end on. Again, thank you, Sarah, for a phenomenal program. There are a few more questions out there. We hope to see many of you in person at the Rookery at Lincoln Park Zoo on May 9th from 6 to 8. Do get your tickets because it is a limited event. And over some fine hors d'oeuvres, we'll get to spend time in the Rookery with these scientists. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to all the research that's already happened.
Hey, Brian, Fox, can I just add
Yes.
one thing? Look for us at the Rookery. If you can get to the Rookery, it's just getting started. It's a fascinating experience. You'll likely run into one of us outside the Rookery. Look for the group of people pointing up in the trees. We'll be there. So I hope you can make it.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Thanks for keeping eyes on there while I'm still down in Champaign.
Yay. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And this will be edited and
you.
posted on our website soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Share it with your friends.